Hello, everyone, and welcome to Out of Nowhere. Well, my guest today is Graham Rendell. Graham is an author who primarily writes about the pilot aircrew encounters with UFOs, diving deep into the subject of World War II sightings. He released his critically acclaimed book, UFOs Before Roswell, an aviation historian who has been interested in aircraft UFOs for over 5 decades. He has delivered presentations at Roswell across Britain. Graham is also the host of 3 bite-sized UFO YouTube channels highlighting little-known cases from over the last 100 years. My God, he's getting old. Can we please welcome Graham to the show? Hello there.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having us on.
How did it all start for you then? What got
Well,
you interested?
I've got my mother to blame for it basically because I used to read science fiction when I was about 8 year old, and I'd read if you remember the Isaac Asimov novels that you used to get, the paperback novels, I, Robot, the Foundation series, all those books, and they had really nice drawings of spaceships on the front, the cover art of these paperback novels back in the mid-70s. And they were drawn by an artist called Chris Foss, who was quite famous for his science fiction artwork back in the day. And my mum bought me this book, which she thought was another one of these Asimov novels. And it turned out to be a book by Brinsley Le Poe Trench, which was Mysterious Visitors. And it had a picture of a flying saucer on the front of it. Now, it was actually a book about UFOs. Now, she didn't know that. And then when I started reading it, I realized, obviously, the first page, it wasn't fiction. It wasn't a science fiction novel. It was purporting to be fact about, strange things that had happened. From then, it was looking at things which were happening back in the 1950s and the 1960s. And actually, he went on to things which were back in biblical times as well. So that kind of got me thinking. And I was a bit of a sponge back then for all things to do with anything, basically. Anything that caught my eye, piqued my interest, then I was just diving in straight away. So after a while, I'd obviously read this book. I dug out everything I could in my local library in northern Newcastle, all the books on UFOs, and there was actually a shelf full of them back then. So this is about 1973, 1974 maybe. And it was a long shelf of UFO titles back then. I've actually still got some of those books because obviously I've bought them since, and I can remember some of the titles even now that I used to read from the library. And then, of course, after that, I started picking them out myself and getting them bought for birthday presents. And if I saw them at secondhand bookshops, I'd buy them. So yeah, I amassed a huge library, and I was just really interested. Anything that came on the telly about UFOs, such as it was back then, I would watch all that. Now, obviously, I didn't know about Flying Saucer Review and some of the specialist magazines. But, if you live it as a teenager, if you're living in a provincial city in northern England, then you're not necessarily going to find out about these things really easily. So I did what I could.
I bet you did as well. When was the first time you went to the archives then?
Oh, well, the first time I went to the archives was about 5 years ago. And I was down in London anyway. And it was it made sense because I was researching the first book I was writing, which was called UFOs Before Roswell. That's a book about not just the Foo Fighters of World War II, but other UFO sightings during that conflict in Europe. So I knew that some people had tried to write books and had actually written a couple of books on the subject, but it wasn't like they weren't in depth. They were, but some of the things needed to be checked out a little bit further. And I knew full well that there must have been other reports that were buried away in the squadron record files and some intelligence reports. So I started looking through those to try and get some information. And actually, you could look at the squadron reports online. You didn't have to go down to the archives. So it was more the stuff that hadn't been. It wasn't actually. It was just the stuff that hadn't digitized, that you had to make a personal visit and go through their own books, if you like. And you can do that. You get a reader's ticket from the archives. You can go down. You can look through 20 odd different files a day in advance. You just ask for which ones you want, and then on the day you can search for more as well. So it's quite nice, and as long as you book it well in advance, you get the day that you want to go down. So it works out quite well for me. Every time I've either got to be down in London for something else or I'm making a special trip, I will go to the archives and spend either a day or 2 days down there.
Very interesting. What about, I think, if I'm right in saying, about the Blue Book archives?
Well, they're in America. Yeah. Well, so they're in America, but actually you can see them online as well. So there's a lot of stuff on the Internet Archive, it's called. You just do a search for Project Blue Book, or you can actually filter them so you get the records, and then you can filter them by year, by even by month if you like, and you can find them that way. They're on the NICAP site as well. You can dig out them. There's various different websites where you can find pretty much all the publicly available Blue Book records. So they're quite easy to look through. It's more the stuff that's a bit more sort of less obvious, if you like, and a bit more hidden away. They're the ones that take a bit of finding. And that includes a lot of the US Air Force and US Army Air Force records from, sort of the wartime and afterwards. Those records themselves, which aren't necessarily to do with UFOs, but might include things about sightings which could be construed as UFOs, then you have to approach the Historic Records Agency in Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama to find those kind of files and get those. And I've done that before as well, especially for the wartime records, for bomber units and night fighter units. And you get them on microfilm. They'll just send you the
Oh, the
PDFs.
microfilm, yeah.
Oh yeah, but they actually digitize the microfilms, and then they just send you a file which you can and you just read through. You don't even need a microfilm reader. And it got to the point where when I was researching UFOs before Roswell, they asked me to stop sending them requests because I'd sent them like a half a dozen or something, and they were trying to work their way through them. And they were saying, "Please don't send us any more for the time being. We're still trying to to get these done for you." So they're quite good. They're very efficient. It takes about a month for the turnaround, which seems a long time, but actually when they're having to dig out things from huge numbers of files they have, then I don't begrudge them, like 4 weeks sort of thing.
When you're starting writing your book, it must be quite hard to try and get all these files and get them all up to date. And
It
how
can
does it
be,
take
yeah.
you? How does it, how long does it take you to write your book?
Well, UFOs Before Roswell was written in 7 months, would you believe? From kind of like nailing down what I wanted to write about and then getting the information. But bearing in mind, I'd pretty much taken early retirement then. I didn't have any other kind of like part-time jobs. I was simply writing each day. I hadn't even taken my occupational pension. I was waiting to get that because I'd left work before I was 55.
Ah,
So
right.
I had months to wait for my pension. So I thought, look, I'm going to get this book out. And I had plenty of time to do it. So it was really good. So yeah, that's what I did.
You just get on with things.
Yeah, well, you
Have
have
you ever
to.
done any research over the northeast coast then? With
Not specifically, but then again, the squadron records take you all over the place. They'll take you, from takeoffs in Britain, if you like, from the bases in Yorkshire, right across the North Sea and into Germany, and then obviously the bombing raids, and then they came back. So you never know where these sightings might actually happen. And you have to look. Sometimes you're lucky and you get locations. Other times you're not. So you have to be a bit kind of like wary about what the information you get and what it leads to. Some of it's quite vague, but there are stories of things in wartime that actually happened down the east coast of England. Now, a little bit further north from you, in Northumberland, there was a case in beginning of January 1944 where a high-flying Spitfire pilot coming back from the south and going back to his base at Aberdeen encountered 4 rectangular-shaped objects at 22,000 feet. So you've got that's in the unit record for the operational training unit. It was actually a coastal command unit that he was flying with, and those records I found in the archives. The story had originally been alluded to in one of John Hanson's books, but
John.
the details were incorrect because he I don't know where he got his information from, but it had said in that book that they were triangular shaped, and they weren't. They were rectangular, because it actually says in the actual document that the pilot gave his briefing, once he landed, that's what he'd said. They were black rectangles, and he'd seen them at 22,000 feet. So, and that was over Anakin, Northumberland.
Oh my God! Yeah. Let's have a look. Where we're going from here. Right. Let's have a look. Yeah, the UFOs before Roswell. About the Wellington bomber. I can't get it up, but I can show it there.
Yeah, that's a Wellington. Yeah, so that's a Wellington Mark II. So yeah, there's a story in UFOs before Roswell about a Polish bomber crew flying a Wellington from 301 Squadron, which were based in Lincolnshire. and they'd attacked the Essen in the Ruhr. This is March 1942. And they were coming back from the bombing raid, and they were flying back over Holland, over what is now the Zuider Zee, the inland sea just next to Amsterdam. And behind them was this orange kind of flattened disc coming up behind them, and the rear gunner in the crew shouted a warning over the intercom to the pilot, saying, "We've got this, this light coming up behind us." And of course, the pilot thought this was a night fighter, a German aircraft coming up to shoot them down. So the pilot said to the rear gunner, this would be like anything that was coming up behind them. It gets close enough, open fire at it, and that would be standard practice. And of course, that happened. So the rear gunner opened up with 4 machine guns, 0.303-inch machine guns, the Brownings they had in the back turret. And every 10th round was a tracer round, so you could see where the bullets were going in the dark, and that's how the gunners worked. And these bullets went into the object, into this orange disc, and didn't come out the other side. Now, they didn't also, it seemed to strike the object. They just seemed to be absorbed by it, according to the crew, according to the pilot, who gave an account of it maybe 2 decades after this happened. And it wasn't like an aircraft, so it wasn't catching fire. It wasn't being destroyed by the bullets going into this, whatever this thing was. And it just seemed to just absorb the bullets. Anyway, after about maybe, I don't know how many rounds had been fired at this thing, because it's not clear. But after a couple of minutes of every so often the gunner having a go at it, it moved round to the port wingtip of the aeroplane. And it was standing off the wingtip as the bomber was going through the skies over Holland at probably just under 200 miles an hour. And of course, as it was moving around, like from behind the tail to around to the port wingtip, the tail gunner was turning his turret to basically have a go at it every so often. And of course, as it gets off the wingtip, it's far enough away that the nose turret gunner can turn his turret almost back on it, not quite back on itself, but it had a limited traverse backwards, and he can shoot past the engines towards beyond the wingtip. And he was firing at this thing as well. He was actually the bomb aimer, and he could actually basically climb into the nose gun turret because it didn't have a dedicated gunner in the front. It was like he had a dual purpose role. Anyway, so the bomb aimer got into the turret and started turning his turret and firing at this light as well. So both turrets in the Wellington were having a go of shooting at this thing, and it was just taking the bullets. Nothing was happening to it at all. And then it moved round to the front of the aeroplane and took station off the nose of the aeroplane, some distance ahead. And again, they're flying through the sky at 200 miles an hour, and this thing's just sitting at a certain distance away. And the gunner, and the nose gunner, is now shooting at it alone, and nothing's happening. So, the Polish crew, they were probably, it's not said as much, but they were probably terrified because this thing's just absorbing bullets. They don't know whether it's an enemy, a secret weapon. That they probably just think it's German. And they're trying to shoot it down, but it's not attacking them, but it's not getting out of their way either. So they're probably scared, what this thing is. And all of a sudden, it just shoots up at an angle at 45 degrees and disappears off into the heavens at great speed. And they're nonplussed about what this thing is. Now, it wouldn't have been kind of maybe taken seriously in terms of a story, if not when they got back on the ground and they're doing the debriefing with the intelligence officer at the squadron when they landed. But the crew behind them in the bomber stream, in the group of aircraft that are flying along over Holland coming home, they said, we saw that as well. We saw it behind you kind of thing. So there was a bit of credence. The trouble is, though, with this case, we've only got the pilot's word for it because there is no documentation, or at least nothing I've been able to find yet, which actually comes as a result of them telling the intelligence officers, this is what we saw during the raid in the usual debriefing. Now, they must have made a report on that, but trying to find it is another thing entirely. But I'm not sort of convinced that it's not there. I'm just assuming that it's buried somewhere, and it's not a case of being maliciously buried. It's more a case of it's just filed under a reference or a file name that we don't know what to look for yet. So I'm not attributing any kind of sort of surreptitious kind of blame to anybody saying, oh, we're going to hide this information from the public, because they weren't like that back then. UFOs weren't a thing in 1942. Flying saucers weren't a thing in 1942. Everybody that saw strange things in the sky just thought they were the other side's secret weapons. And that's the kind of thinking they had back then. But yeah, the guy, the Polish pilot, he moved to Canada after the war. He was actually living in America for a couple of years, but he eventually moved to Canada. And in 1962, he gave an interview to somebody who supplied information to Flying Saucer Review, the magazine, and it appeared in a magazine, in one of the magazines that year. And it's appeared in various books since then, but you've got to dig for it. You don't see it in a lot of books. The first time I ever came across the story was in a French language book, believe it or not, that was published in 1970. So, that's the kind of things I dig into. That's where I first found it.
But,
and I've seen various
talking about this,
variations of the pilot's name, his rank, and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the information about it's wrong. But if you go into the squadron records, you'll find all the true stuff about him and his crew, etc. So that's the kind of lengths I go to.
this orange object, what was it like then?
Well, they just said it was an orange disc, a very bright orange disc. And it was so big they could see like the bullets going into it and nothing, and then weren't coming out the other side of it. So they thought it was some kind of strange airplane. But if bullets and that amount of bullets that hit this thing, if that had happened, then surely it would have been damaged. It would have gone down in flames or exploded. But nothing happened to it at all.
Mason's in the chat room and said, "Good evening, Graham. Any stories from Plymouth, particularly the naval base?"
Oh, yeah, from Plymouth. Well, not enough come across, but then again, the naval records are something I haven't actually looked at yet. So at some stage in the future, I might get onto that kind of thing. But I haven't looked through Fleet Air Arm records yet. The only things on a naval dimension I've actually looked through are some of the squadrons from the Royal Air Force who did anti-submarine patrols over the North Sea or over the Atlantic or the Bay of Biscay. Now, there is a story, if I can just tell you this one as well, which does have a kind of like a naval, I suppose it has a little bit of a naval connection. And this is later in 1942 again. Now, the Americans had just sent their first aeroplanes to operate out of Britain in about, at least on anti-submarine patrols in about November 1942. So you had Liberators flying out of bases in Devon and Cornwall, which were flying over the Bay of Biscay, which is the sea just off Spain and France. And there was one of these, it was actually an American Air Force unit, an American Army Air Force unit, which was doing anti-submarine patrols before the US Navy got on board with their own units in Devon and Cornwall. And it was a B-24 Liberator crew who were flying over the Bay of Biscay one day in November 1942. And behind them, it was daytime, and behind them comes this huge wingless object, and it's following them, and they don't know what it is. Now, they didn't open fire at it, but they did, or at least there was somebody on board the airplane, which apparently he took pictures of it, and he took at least 6 images of it.
Well, really?
And there were supposed to be really good images that showed a very clear object, but those pictures have never been found. And the person who took the pictures, he was a tech sergeant in the army. And he was killed on a raid about 3 months later, again over the Bay of Biscay on another anti-submarine patrol. So nobody can question him. But the information comes from the ball gunner, the lower gunner underneath the fuselage of the Liberator. And he contacted Leonard Stringfield, who was a UFO researcher and author, back in the 1950s, in 1955. And he contacted him then with this story about how he and his crew had seen this thing come up behind them. And it followed the aircraft for quite a long time, maybe 10 minutes or so, and then just did a 180-degree turn and just flew off. But apparently they had these pictures. And of course, these pictures would have been given to the intelligence officers of that US Army Air Force squadron when they got back to base with a debrief. There would have been, the film would have been processed, and if anything had come on it, then who knows what happened to those pictures. Again, those are things which seem to be hidden away for some reason or other. Yeah. Now, I have tried to find the squadron records. It was the 361st bomber wing. Bomber Squadron, I beg your pardon, or called the first anti-submarine wing. It was renamed at about November, December 1942. Now, you can make a search for those in the US Army Air Force records at Maxwell Air Force Base, and I did that. And then when the information came back, the records don't exist, or at least they can't find them. Now, again, you have to think, well, is there something going on here, or is it just the fact that, for some reason they weren't digitized or the records have been lost? So I don't know, but it might just be that the search term isn't quite accurate enough. But those are definitely the names of the squadrons that squadron that the aircraft belonged to. So you do a thought for that month, then some of that information should be there. But apparently that month, the information doesn't exist. It has stuff on the lead up to then when they were still training in America before they came over the Atlantic. But then when you get in November, those first few weeks, that information is very sparse, and it doesn't mention the raids, and it should. So I've got to do a bit more digging to try and find a bit more information about the story. And I'm surprised that in the past nobody ever did. In a lot of these other stories, and I'm obviously these things I'm talking about now, I'm surprised that researchers in the past haven't dug into these in much detail, because the information's there. You just need to look. Okay, it might not have been digitized back in the day, but it was available. The stuff, the records have been there for quite a long time.
I suppose now it's all changed. They'll be all digitized, won't they now?
Yeah, maybe. I just don't know what the answer is, to be honest. So
yeah, let's go on to the next one. Dawn of the Flying Saucers, 1946 to 1949, with a Mustang.
Yeah, so the cover art I've got behind me there's the cover of the book, funny enough. So we've got a P-51 or an F-51 Mustang, because they changed the designation of the airplane in the late 40s. Yeah. So the US Army Air Force became the US Air Force at the end of 1947. So the change also the designation. So the wartime airplane, the fighters, were called a P-47, P-51, etc., P-38 Lightning. But they changed them to F instead of P. So the aircraft we're looking at in the late 40s as the F-51 Mustang. And they were still equipping Air National Guard units even into the early 1950s, even though the Americans had jets then. So one of the story, well, I can talk about two different stories, including Mustangs that were from the late 40s. So one of them is quite well known, and this is January 1948. So it's just when Project Sign had been basically created. So it was only like the first week or so. In fact, it was actually just before Sign had been kind of like formally established, but they already set it up. This is the first United States Air Force official UFO investigation program. And it was yet to be officially kind of created, but the personnel were in place. They had an idea about what they wanted to look for. And this is one of the first cases that basically ended up in their laps. And it was the Thomas Mantell case, which a lot of you out there might know about. But for those of you who don't, I'll just give you a quick recap.
Yeah,
so
please.
It's the 7th of January, 1948. There's a flight of 4 F-51 Mustangs. They're flying back from Georgia to their base in Kentucky. And they happen to pass Godman Airfield, which is near Fort Knox. And about the same time as they're approaching the airfield, the tower operators and some of the personnel on the airfield had seen this object in the sky to the south towards the Tennessee border. And they didn't know what it was, and they were looking at it. There'd already been reports earlier in the day from police and from civilian witnesses all across Ohio and also from Kentucky to say that something strange was in the sky. So all these reports were built up. That filtered through the Air Force via the police, and also now And now the Air Force officers in the tower at Godman Airfield were seeing this thing in the sky. It seemed to be quite a long way away, but it looked to be huge. They didn't know what it was, so they asked the flight of 4 aircraft, which was being led by this Captain Thomas Mantell, to go and investigate. Now, as it transpired, only one of them seemed to have oxygen. Or at least thought they had a working oxygen system. One didn't have enough fuel to make the pursuit, so he went off and flew on to land at where they were supposed to be landing. So only 3 took up the pursuit. Another one of the 3 ended up he couldn't get high enough because he was having trouble breathing because he didn't have an oxygen system.
Right.
So if you get to a certain height in an airplane without an oxygen system, you get hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen, and it affects your brain, it affects your senses, and you can lead to you dying basically. If you black out, you might crash, but also it might give you significant brain damage. So you have to pilots had to be really careful. So they got to a certain height, chasing after this thing, and one of the pilots couldn't make it, and his wingman actually took him back to base, and this left Captain Thomas Mantell chasing this UFO. Now, there's a bit of debate in the official records as to whether or not he had a working oxygen supply. And it depends on what you read and where you read it. Either he did or he didn't, or he had a working supply, but it wasn't hooked up, or it just hadn't been, there was no oxygen bottles in the airplane. But whatever, he started climbing. He was climbing to about 20,000 feet. And according to the transcript of the conversation that he had with the tower, he said that he could still see it at that height. It was above him, and that he was going to close in to take a closer look at it. Now, it got the point that soon afterwards, people living quite close to the Tennessee border with Kentucky, there was a farmhouse down there, and his aircraft crashed into the backyard of this farmhouse. It seemed to plummet out of the sky, and his watch had stopped at something like 3:15 in the afternoon or whatever. Now his body was in the wreckage. So it fell out of the sky. And the official story is that basically he blacked out. He lost control because he didn't have enough oxygen to breathe. But other people have tried to claim that the UFO did something to his airplane. I remember reading years ago, this is decades ago, that it was claimed that his aircraft had been, or the wreckage was full of tiny little holes, that the UFO had done something to it. It shot some kind of death ray at his airplane. And that's all rubbish. That was probably some sensational kind of magazine article or book back that I read, maybe 40 or 50 years ago. And I can't even remember exactly where it came from now. But the official story is that he blacked out because of lack of oxygen. But he was chasing something. And who knows what happened that day, but he did actually unfortunately die in the pursuit of a UFO. Now, some people afterwards said that it was nothing more than a weather balloon or a secret Navy research balloon called Skyhook, which had been launched from somewhere in Indiana nearby, and it had drifted over that part of the kind of Kentucky-Tennessee border, and he was chasing nothing more than a weather balloon. Before that, J. Allen Hynek, who had been the civilian research sort of advisor to sign, he'd said that it might have been Venus. So there was all these stories coming out that from different places saying that he was chasing this, that, or the other. So I'm not sure now. Obviously, it's well over 50 years. It's like 70 odd years now. We'll ever know really the difference, what he actually chased that day. But it's a story that just won't go away. So it's quite an intriguing one. But there was another one in the same year. So this is again 1948, and this is October that year. And there's again a flight of F-51 Mustangs, again another Air National Guard unit, and this is further north towards the Canadian border, and they're coming back from a training mission, and one by one, 3 of the pilots land. But a 4th one decides to stay up and do a bit of night flying practice in the dark before he lands.
Right.
And he's flying over this town, which is right next to where the airfield was. And he sees a light below him, flying underneath him, if you like. And you can see it above the lights of the town. And it's not an aeroplane, because there was an airplane coming to land at the airport as well, a civilian airplane. And it wasn't that, because the people on board that airplane saw this light as well, and they saw the Mustang. So he gets permission off the tower, and he chases after this thing. And then there's a dogfight that basically develops above the town, above the airfield, where he's trying to get on the tail of this light, because that's all he can define it as. And the light's trying to get behind him. And then the light makes head-on passes at his aircraft. And I mean, kind of who's going to play chicken, who's going to break first kind of passes. And the first pass, it goes head on for him, and he has to dive below it in case he thinks it's going to hit him. And the second time, he stands his ground. He keeps going, and the thing breaks off above him and shoots just vertically into the air. And he tries to follow it in a vertical climb. Now, his aircraft is simply not powerful enough to catch up with this, even though it's quite a powerful airplane, the F-51, the Mustang, Rolls-Royce engine, etc. Packard Merlin, the American version. It can't keep up with this light, and it gets into an engine stall, which means the engine can't produce enough power for the aircraft to keep going upwards. It just falls out of the sky. He managed to get control of it again, but then it goes on for another third head-on attack at him, and then it's lost. It just disappears. And of course, it frightened the life out of the pilot. And he was interviewed afterwards, and he gave an account of what happened. And the official story is, again, it was a weather balloon released from a nearby airfield. Except the weather balloons that were released there were painted black. They were called pieballs,
Yeah.
and it would never have been seen in the dark, and they didn't have lights on them either. So what was he chasing? And it wasn't a weather balloon, and he was adamant it wasn't anyway.
Yeah, Mason's just asking, have you done any investigation into commercial airlines?
Yes, there are plenty of stories of commercial airliners meeting up with UFOs, even in the late 40s and early 50s. So that there are famous stories of people seeing lighted objects or long objects with what look like rows of lights down the side. So yeah, there's plenty of stories along those. And if you look at my books, not just the Dawn of the Flying Saucers, which is the 1946 to 1949 cases, but if you look at Flying Saucer Fever, which is 50 to 52, Intercept and Identify, which is 53 to 54, and Chasing Shadows, which is 55 to 56, they're packed full of those kind of stories, not just military cases.
Rebecca's just saying here in the chat, I'll get it up. Any accounts of any pilots being shot back at?
Not really shot back at. There is a story from April 1945 where the pilots or the crew of an aircraft reckoned they were affected by a UFO. Now, there's a story it's actually the last bombing raid of World War II for RAF Bomber Command. And it happened they were attacking Berchtesgaden, which was Hitler's his mountaintop retreat in southern Germany near the Austrian border. And it was an Australian crew, an Australian pilot from 9 Squadron called Kit Williams. And he was, they were flying somewhere not quite near where the target was, but they were on a place where they would turn on the route to the target, one of the last turning points. And he reckoned that something flew past the front of their aeroplane that he described as an army blanket. It was a large flat object that just shot past the front of his Lancaster bomber. Now, they were carrying 12,000-pound, what they called tall boy bombs. So a single 12,000-pound bomb, which was what they were kind of the earthquake bombs, the ones that used to drop on railway viaducts and submarine pens. These things could penetrate a lot of concrete. And when they exploded, there was a huge shockwave. And it was designed, they were just going to knock the hell out of Hitler's mountaintop retreat with these huge bombs. Now, as soon as this thing flew past his cockpit, the actual bomb shackles that kept the bomb in the bomb bay basically released. They just kind of like broke apart. And the bomb fell onto the bomb bay doors and broke through the doors and fell away. So that was the effect on the electrics on the airplane. All 4 engines cut out, and the airplane plummeted from the sky, according to Kit Williams, the pilot. And he only managed to restart the engines when they dropped, several thousand feet of altitude. And then when they got back to base, he was affected so much that he couldn't land the aircraft properly. They almost ran off the runway. And then the crew were getting headaches and other kind of, strange kind of like feelings. Apparently one of the gunners ended up in hospital for a week afterwards. So he said. And he was interviewed by James MacDonald, who was a noted UFO researcher in the late 60s, who traveled to Australia to interview people like this, who said that they'd seen various, strange things during the war and afterwards. So there is a transcript, and actually an audio transcript of this particular interview that James MacDonald did with a Lancaster pilot. And it goes on for quite a long time. It's quite detailed. And it does appear in UFOs Before Roswell. I managed to get a copy of it and put it in there.
Oh, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. We'll carry on. Flying Saucers Fever, 1950, 1952, with can we see it? There we go.
So just to give it like a bit of an international flavor. So we're not just talking about British and American kind of cases. Here's a Russian case. So this actually is from somewhere in Siberia, which I actually visited back in 1992, believe it or not. I had a trip around Russia photographing airplanes just after the wall came down. It's one of my other interests is aircraft. So that's why I do pilot and aircrew encounters, because I know a little bit about the subject, about the history of kind of using airplanes in wartime, but also other types of airplane as well. So there was a place up in northeastern Siberia called Chersky. It's only about 60 miles from the Arctic Ocean. Originally it was built as a town to serve as like a supply depot, if you like, for the gulags, for the for their kind of concentration camps that they would put political prisoners into and get them to work in the work camps and basically just work them to death, basically in the 1930s, the 1940s, and afterwards. That's what the Soviet Union did. When we got there, it was just a town of about 2,000 people, and it was a polar research base. But around the area, down the river, the Kolyma, you could see what was left of these gulags. Anyway, back in 1950, they were still operating. And so it's quite a sensitive area. And of course, because it was next to the Arctic Ocean, then the Russians were paranoid about American bombers flying over the Arctic Ocean to attack targets in Russia. So it was they wanted it to be a heavily defended area, but they didn't really have the resources to do it just then. It would happen later on that they had missile bases and airfields on the north coast, etc., etc. But in 1950, there was a sighting over this town called Chersky, which I said I visited in 1992. And this object appeared in the sky for 3 days running in the same place. Now, there were no air bases up there. There were no military aeroplanes. They had to actually send them up there in stages. And they sent interceptors. And they were probably these aircraft, the Lvovshin La-11 Fangs, which were the last of the kind of piston-engine Russian Air Force fighters. They were long-range aeroplanes. They could fly a considerable distance without refueling. Now, those aircraft would have come from the nearest kind of air base they had was Yakutsk, which is well over 1,000 miles away. So they would have to fly in stages, using some of the bases that the Russians had built to actually deliver American-built airplanes over from Alaska to Siberia to Moscow during the war under what they called the Lend-Lease Agreement, which was America supplying Russia with airplanes to help them fight the war. So there were these little kind of airstrips hacked out of the taiga, out of the wood, out of all the forests. And these aircraft would have used these airstrips to get up to Chersky, because they did send fighters up to see what this object was. Right. And then when the squadron got there with these fighters, they sent the airplanes up, but the thing flew off. And then it came back the next day as well. And of course, they had no luck in trying to intercept this object, but they'd seen it for 3 days. And it looked like, it was described as just like a big ball, like a Saturn shape. And that's all it was. But that's kind of a case that came out of Russia. And of course, Russia was notoriously kind of secretive about a lot of things, especially military stuff. So, good luck trying to find files on that episode. But that story came out several decades ago, and it's a story that very few people have tried to dig into or even just talk about. It's just one of those things that gets buried away.
I can imagine so. Now, Steph is in the chat room. She just got this coming up. Where are we at? Mm-hmm. Kurt Russell's account while piloting aircraft near Phoenix in, I think, 97 is amazing, Mason. He was one of the first airline pilots to report an air traffic control not known as the Phoenix Lights.
Yeah, that was the kind of it was like almost like a boomerang, kind of squared off boomerang shape with all the lights along it. That's right. He was part of that case. Yeah.
Very interesting. Do you know anything about the Belgium Triangle?
The Belgian Triangle, yeah. So there was a wave of cases. It wasn't just one, story. There was huge numbers of stories. The police were seeing them, civilians were seeing them. You name it, people were seeing all over Belgium, and the cases are quite famous across there. And I have spoke to Belgian researchers who, have delved deep into these cases, and they've got, kind of maps, they've got drawings of people, what they saw in terms of in relation to the buildings. Some of them, they'd say, well, the size of football fields, this kind of thing. It was crazy. The stories are coming out. And of course, you got the case of the Belgian Air Force F-16s that tried to intercept some of these that were popping up on radar, and they couldn't lock onto them, and they were just losing them. But they did try to actually send a military aircraft against them.
How strange is that then? That they couldn't lock onto them.
Yep, it's really, again, it's just more cases of the Air Force, whichever Air Force it is, being effectively impotent in the face of strange things that people can't understand. But then again, the U.S. Air Force have had decades, through the 50s, 60s, and 70s of sending aircraft up to try and intercept UFOs and just failing miserably.
Well, I know from going off this coast down in here, Me and Paul have seen the orange lights appear 13 times.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all these planes arrive.
Yeah.
They send planes out because they've been seen, probably maybe seen on radar, I don't know. And then all of a sudden you see all these jets arrive all over the place, but they've gone.
Yeah.
These lights have disappeared.
Does anybody have like airband scanners? Does anybody try to pick up the communications on the radio? On using various frequencies?
I've tried. I had a. It's strange enough, it was an old transistor radio, but you could tune it in to hear pilots. Strange enough. And many a time I said to Paul, bloody hell, I ain't breaking me back tonight. How strange is that? And then since then, I've got a better one.
Right, because you have digital scanners now where you can tune them in and they're quite easily. And but then again, I think some of the pilots, when they're speaking air to air, sometimes they use secure frequencies, so you can't always listen into them. But there's a lot of stuff you can listen to, in terms of landing and takeoffs and things like that. If you know where they're coming from, you can pick up some information. So that it might be worth trying that occasionally if you know that they're setting up airplanes.
I know. Have you got one then? You've got one of these.
I used to, yeah. I don't have one anymore, but it's not something I've got time to do anymore.
I like it.
Yeah, I've had scanners in the past. I've had a couple of different ones. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to get an up-to-date one probably. The one I've got's quite an old one.
Right.
In fact, it came in charity shop, and I'm looking at. I thought, I said you can pick up pilots in the sky and out at sea, and I thought, I'll get that. Paid a tenner for it.
I mean, there's a story from, I think it's like 15 or 20, it might be 10 or 15 years ago. There's two pilots from Lakenheath in Suffolk flying F-15s, and they came up, against something that they couldn't understand. And some of the transcripts on radio, if you search for it, you'll find it on the internet. You can actually find the transcript of the conversation. The two pilots were either having with each other or they were having with ground control, being kind of vectored in towards this, whatever this thing was during the daytime. And it's a bit intriguing. It doesn't come with a huge amount of detail about what they were looking at, because I don't think they knew either. But it wasn't an aeroplane, it wasn't a balloon or anything. It's just something that just kind of like frustrated the hell out of them.
It must be fascinating to listen to what the pilots have got to say and say, they've gone, they've vanished in front of us.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you want us to do now?
Yeah, back to base for tea and biscuits.
Yeah. Have you ever done any research about Rendlesham around that area?
No,
around that area?
No, because it's not really kind of aerial sightings. I mean, there's a 1956 sighting from Lakenheath, where the sent an RAF Venom night fighter up against a light that had been seen flying around the base. The Americans had tried to send a T-33 shooting star up to have a look to see what it was, but the two pilots on board couldn't make out what it was, and they couldn't get anywhere near it. So the RAF were asked to send night fighters, and about 3 or 4 attempts were made, and various crews did try to go in search to intercept this light, and one did, but then they said the light got on their tail, so they spent then the time trying to shake it off their tail, because they were getting a little bit worried that whatever this thing was, it was sitting on their tail. So that was 1956. And that's quite a famous case as well.
Has there any been over Buckingham Palace?
Not that I'm aware of, but I wouldn't say never.
Yeah, because you never know. What about the White House?
Again, well, that'll probably come under the 1952 sightings, the 2 July weekends, when there was a fleet of things seen on radar and visually over Washington, D.C. So the first weekend was the 19th and 20th of July, 1952. And now they sent up interceptors from a nearby airbase, about half an hour's flying time away. And then when the airplanes turned up on station, these things melted away into the background. And then when the jets had to go away because they were low on fuel, they came back. And they were seen by airline crews as well. So it wasn't just because the official word was that there were temperature inversions caused by, radar kind of angels caused by temperature inversions. But some of the airliner pilots who had been asked to go and have a look when they were either flying into the Washington National or coming out of Washington National, they were asked to have a look, and they said, "Yeah, we can see these these various lights." And one pilot reckoned that he'd had a whole number of lights just clustered around his airplane at one point. And he was a bit kind of worried because he wasn't sure what they were.
I remember one where he was, I think it was a commercial pilot, him and they were just flew around him, round the side of it and underneath him, and then came in front of him. And he said it was massive.
Yeah, the stories like that quite often, yeah, where you see things, they seem to maneuver around airplanes.
But it must be very difficult for a pilot to say something when they land.
It is. I mean, first of all, when they encounter something, they've got to think of the safety of their airplane and their passengers if it's a commercial airline. So that's the first kind of like worry, if you like. But then when they get back on the ground and they've got to report it, or at least, back in the day, they would report these things. And then got the point where there was stigma and there would be a bit of pushback from the companies, are you sure this is what you've seen? And it got to the point where they would just clam up, they just wouldn't tell people because either there was a professional reputation at stake, or are they fit for the loony bin, as we used to call it?
Yes, yeah.
Are they going to be passed fit to fly in the next medical examination? Because do we think they're seeing things? So yeah,
I think a lot of them have said that they were frightened of losing the pension.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Because
and you can understand that, can't you?
It must be difficult.
Yeah.
But that's what happens in life. So what you're looking into the future now with?
So I'm doing a sequel to the book about the World War II UFO sighting. So it's going to be called Shadows Over the Reich, and I'm halfway through it at least. I've been digging this week actually into further RAF squadron records, and they're coming up with stories of things they call rockets in early 1944, which are chasing after the bombers. And not just chasing after them on straight and level. That the Lancaster kind of crews are doing evasive maneuvers, what they call corkscrews, to try and what they would do to shake off an enemy fighter. And these so-called rockets are basically following them through the maneuvers. So that's something that the Germans didn't have back in January 1944. And I've found two separate reports from just one squadron, 467 Squadron, which is an Australian bomber squadron fighting with the RAF in 1944 from bases in England against the Germans. And that's just two reports out of two different months. It's actually January 1944. And then I found another report similar in March 1944 as well from the same unit. So there are more stories there just to find. Just from just kind of like casual searches. And I'm really surprised nobody's actually gone through these records before to find this information. So yeah, there'll be another book that comes out with a whole load of stories like this.
I'm going to say it sounds as though there's only you looking into all this.
There's been a couple of other people. There's a guy called Keith Chester who wrote a book in 2007 called Strange Company. We're friends. We speak to each other on social media occasionally. He wrote this really good book, and it was more to do with Europe and the Pacific War as well. But in terms of how in depth it went, it wasn't hugely in depth in terms of trying to find out what these things were. But it's actually a really good read, and I would encourage people to look at it if they have the chance. And then look at mine.
Have you ever done anything about the Antarctic?
No, but I've looked at the story of the so-called Nazi flying saucers from Admiral Byrd's supposed ill-fated expedition of end of 1946, early 1947, where they were supposed to be chased off the continent. The trouble is, there's no substance to it at all, and there's no substance either to the idea that the Germans built flying saucers during World War II. There's lots of stories out there. I could go on for another hour now about and I'm not going to, but you can read about it in UFOs Before Roswell, because I've devoted about 3 or 4 chapters to this. There's a load of stories out there that say that the Germans invented things like that, and that they flew them, and that these things would have been used in places like Antarctica and stuff, at the end of the war and afterwards. But when you delve a bit more deeply into the origins of these stories, that's when you come across brick walls. You can't go any further back. And you go back to about as early as 1950, and you can't go any further back, because basically that's when people were coming out telling these stories, and that's all they are, because they've got no real substance to them. And the things that some of them were saying don't add up anyway. But I go into a lot more depth. But that's the kind of substance to it, that there isn't any, and it's just a kind of all these interwoven stories. And if you tell them often enough in a number of places, they almost become fact, if you like, but they're not really.
Yeah, understand that. What's the most unusual story you've come across with planes and UFOs?
Unusual story. Oh dear, that's put us on the spot. I it's difficult to sort of unusual because they've all got their unusual elements in them. I mean, I guess I was gonna say there's some wartime ones where they just kind of just don't know what they're looking at, and they have these lights where they just appear out of nowhere, and then they look around and then they fly off again. The Foo Fighters, I'll talk about the Foo Fighters because they're strange in so much that they were just lights that would follow American night fighters over Western Germany, Eastern Belgium, Eastern France, towards the end of 1944, early 1945. And the crews were spooked by these things
I bet
because they
there
were
was.
simply just red, orange, or white lights. They're following the aeroplanes. And it didn't matter what kind of maneuvers they were doing to shake off these, what they thought were German night fighters. They couldn't shake them, but they weren't opening fire at them. So they didn't know what the hell they were, but they were really scared. And it got to the point where the intelligence officer from the squadron, one of the squadrons concerned, the 4th and 5th Night Fighters Squadron, he'd started making a list of all the pilots who were encountering these things, and he had a list of about 14 different events over about a 2 or 3 week period. And of course, he sent it off to headquarters. The headquarters came back to him and said, "Well, what part of the aircraft are these lights attached to?" Because of course they thought they were German night fighters, and he had to go back and say, "Look, they're not attached to anything; they're just lights." And they got thrown further and further up the chain to try and get somebody else trying to answer what these questions were, and it went higher and higher up the echelons of American Air Force Command, if you like, to the point of where it was passed to the British Air Ministry because the Americans didn't have a clue what they were facing. So the British Air Ministry were asked to take a look at it. And then about 2 months later, so you're looking at the end of March 1945. So this is only like maybe 6 weeks before the end of the war, that they finally came out with the idea of that it's just a German jet fighter or some kind of flak rocket that they've invented, and that was it. But of course, it was so close to the end of the war that they didn't want to really do any kind of in-depth investigation
No.
because the war was nearly won. So, once the war was won, they just forgot about it. They tried to interrogate a few high-ranking German scientists and Luftwaffe officers and ask them direct questions about what they called the balls of fire. That was their name, the official name for these Foo Fighters back then. But they got nowhere because the Germans just didn't know what they were either. And some of their pilots allegedly were seeing them as well, but have yet to find documents that prove that.
I'm sure there must have been.
There may well be, but they're hard to find.
Yeah, I can imagine so, yeah. Would you have liked to have flown one of these Wellington bombers?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, certainly. If not, I mean, I suppose I would love to be a fly on the wall in one of these cases to actually see what they were seeing for myself and to see how valid these kind of cases are. And just to be able to come up with a much better description, if you like, because some of the squadron reports are by kind of almost design. They're quite vague, sometimes quite brief as well, because it was wartime. They were trying to get as much information down in a very short period of time. It also depended from unit to unit how good their intelligence officers and their clerks were, for taking the information and transcribing it and then writing it down in the official records. So some of them are quite patchy. Some of them are really detailed. Others a little bit less so, and some not at all. So some of the squadrons, they might have had sightings, but we're just not going to know about them because nothing was written down, unfortunately.
When you talk about these Wellington bombers, how many people would be in the plane then?
In the Wellington, they had a crew of 5. You had tail gunner, bomb aimer, navigator, pilot, and wireless op.
But I suppose how many windows would there be? 2, 4 windows.
There was a turret up front, a turret at the back, in the tail. Now the pilot's cockpit, and then there were certain windows behind the cockpit where they could look out of. There'd be an astrodome. Right. There was an astrodome for navigation purposes, so they could do star fixes, which was just behind the cockpit on the top of the fuselage. There was no dorsal turret, but there was a string of windows. There was a line of windows on each side of the fuselage towards the tail. And they used to occasionally mount side-facing machine guns in those. but they were deleted like because they were too heavy and they were useless really as well. But you could possibly see out those windows as well. So there's different ways you could see out bombers depending on what type it was.
Yeah, like you say, when they were looking out there and seeing these different shapes, objects flying around and thinking, what the hell are them?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there
What
was
do we
different lights in
do?
the sky, during bomber raids. I mean, there was targeting flares. You had fighter flares that were dropped by German airplanes to try and silhouette our bombers against clouds, so they could attack them easier. But these were things that were known. The crews would know what these things were because they used to see them on each raid. Whereas the things I'm talking about and which are being reported and that end up in my books are something completely different because the crews didn't know what they were. And nothing in the kind of the information that's come out since the war to talk about German secret weapons matches these descriptions.
Right. I know we're nearly coming to the end of the show.
Okay.
Where can people find you if they
Mm-hmm.
want to get in touch with some information or anything like that?
Okay.
And where
So
can you get your books?
yeah. So I'm on Facebook, so you can hit me up on Facebook, but I'm also on Twitter, or X as they call it now. So you can search for my name on X. I'm actually more active on there in terms of information I give out anyway. And in terms of my books, well, you can find them on Amazon. But if you do get in touch with me on social media, if you want a signed copy, I can do those as well. So the best thing is to contact me directly through social media if you want one of them. But otherwise, they're available through Amazon, and they're either Kindle or they're hard copies. So yeah, I offer both.
Right. And you're
And
speaking
sorry, and I've got the Bite-Sized UFOs YouTube channel as well. So if you search for
oh,
Bite-Sized
yes.
UFOs
Yeah.
on YouTube, you can find there's about nearly 100 videos with little known cases on those. So there's quite a lot to watch.
Yeah. And you're speaking at the conference in September, aren't you?
At Hull, yes, I am. Yeah, that's the
Well,
Outer Limits conference.
where is it? Cottingham, is it?
It's in Cottingham, that's right.
Yeah.
Just outside Hull.
Yeah, it's not far away. I think it's either a smaller venue or what, I don't know.
I don't know either. I've not been to this one. I was at last year's event. I was a speaker there as well. So he obviously liked what he heard, and so he's asked me back.
Yeah, I think Peter was there last year. Peter Robbins.
Peter Robbins was, yeah. He was really canny. Yeah, he was really nice.
Quite a few people, and there's quite a few people this time as well.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
So I'm sure you'll have a great time with Chris. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he is. Yeah. I've met him a few times now. He's really nice. So, and he knows his stuff as well.
Are you doing any more conferences in the UK this year then?
I'm actually going up to Blair Athol, which was near where the Calvin UFO was seen in August 1990. So that's next Saturday. There's a talk and an exhibition on in the village hall in Blair Athol, which is only a few miles from where the UFO was seen, which is near Pitlochry in the Highlands in Scotland. So I'm going up to not just listen to the talk, but hopefully I might be able to participate in a small way. I've done some research into the squadron histories of the Harriers, and of course there was a Harrier seen in the picture, to try and find out whether any Harriers were in records in terms of being in Scotland. Of course, there's nothing in the official records. Yeah, it's an incredible story as well.
But you found a bit of information out as well.
Well, I found a negative. Let's put it that way. That there's nothing in the records to say that Harriers were north of the border in the beginning of August 1990.
Oh my God! Well, there you go. There you go. So, what you got planned for weekend then?
Doing a bit more writing. So yeah, that tends to fill a lot of my time nowadays. But I work at Beamish as well, the Northeast Open Air Museum. So I do a couple of days there a week, take people down the mine. So if anybody's there visiting, come and say hello. If I'm on, yeah, I'll say hello to you as well.
And you do a bit of train driving.
And I do a bit of that for the Weardale Railway as well, near where I live. Yeah, so I'm learning to drive one of the engines, but I'm an assistant driver.
How far does it go that then?
It's 16 miles.
Oh, that's good then.
Yeah, it's a nice line. Yeah, it goes from Stanhope to Bishop Auckland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can people go on it then and pay to?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a passenger service at Wednesdays and Saturdays. Yeah, and some bank holidays.
Oh, brilliant! That sounds good. That does. Anyway, thank you for coming on the show. Graham,
You're welcome.
it's been very interesting talking to you. It's always nice to people in the chat room to ask questions. It's really
I
nice.
appreciate the comments. Thanks to everybody, and thanks for asking the questions. I'm always happy to answer. If I can answer, I will. If I can't, I'll say I can't. I don't try and make up stuff on the spot.
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you, and everybody have a lovely weekend, because hopefully the sun's going to be out this weekend and it'll be absolutely wonderful. My guest next Wednesday, just trying to think, it's Ben Moss next Wednesday. That's the 30th of July, next Wednesday at 7 p.m. in the UK, 2 o'clock Pacific and 11 o'clock Eastern. I have to think then. Yeah, so thank you again. Good night.
Okay.
God bless.
Yep.